If you walk through the canals of Amsterdam today, past the elegant 17th-century merchant houses with their narrow facades and tall windows, you will see a city that remembers itself as a center of enlightenment and trade. You will see museums celebrating the Dutch Golden Age, paintings by Rembrandt and Vermeer, and monuments to a time when a small nation of fishermen and traders became the richest country on earth. The story the Dutch tell themselves about this era is one of entrepreneurial genius and mercantile innovation. We are taught that the Dutch invented modern capitalism. We are taught that they built their wealth through clever trading, hard work, and financial innovation. We are taught that the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was the world's first multinational corporation, a pioneer of shareholder capitalism that brought exotic spices and prosperity to Europe. But there is a different version of this story. It is a version that you will not find in the glossy coffee table books sold in Amsterdam gift shops. It is a version that is remembered with rage in the villages of Java and the islands of Maluku. In this version of the story, the VOC was not a trading company. It was an armed cartel with a corporate charter. It was a private army that conquered nations, enslaved populations, and committed genocide to control the price of nutmeg. It was a business model built on violence so extreme that it makes the modern drug cartels look like amateurs. This is the story of the Dutch East India Company. It is the story of how a corporation became more powerful than most governments. It is the story of how the pursuit of profit led to the extermination of entire populations. And it is the story of how the very mechanisms that made the VOC the richest company in history also guaranteed its spectacular collapse. To understand this rise and fall, we have to look past the tulips and windmills and into the blood-soaked ledgers of colonial commerce. In 1602, the Netherlands was barely a country. It was a collection of 7 provinces that had recently broken away from Spanish rule. It was a swampy delta at the edge of Europe, with no natural resources, no empire, and no standing army worth mentioning. But what it did have was a strategic location, a seafaring tradition, and a desperate need to survive. The Dutch economy depended on trade. Their ships sailed to the Baltic for grain, to France for wine, and increasingly to Asia for spices. But the spice trade was dominated by the Portuguese, who had established a brutal monopoly over the sea routes to the East Indies. Spices were not a luxury in 17th-century Europe. They were a necessity. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly. Spices like pepper, cloves, and nutmeg were used to preserve food and mask the taste of decay. They were also used in medicine and religious ceremonies. The demand was insane. A single pound of nutmeg could be bought in the Banda Islands for a few pennies and sold in Amsterdam for a price that would buy a small house. It was the cocaine of the Renaissance, a commodity so valuable that men would kill for it. The problem was that the Portuguese and Spanish controlled the routes. They had fortresses in Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. They had papal decrees giving them a monopoly blessed by God himself. If the Dutch wanted a piece of the spice trade, they would have to fight for it. But individual Dutch merchants did not have the resources to challenge the Iberian empires. They needed to pool their capital and share the risk. So in 1602, the Dutch government granted a charter to the United East India Company, known by its Dutch initials as the VOC. The charter was extraordinary. It gave the VOC powers that no private company had ever possessed. The VOC was granted a monopoly on all Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Strait of Magellan. That meant the entire Indian Ocean and the Pacific, but more than that, the VOC was given sovereign powers. It could wage war, it could negotiate treaties, it could establish colonies, it could mint its own currency. It could execute prisoners. It was a state within a state, a corporation with an army and a mandate to extract profit by any means necessary. The investors who bought shares in the VOC were not buying into a peaceful trading venture. They were buying into a military expedition, and the returns were astronomical. In its first years, the VOC paid dividends of 20, 30, sometimes 50%. The streets of Amsterdam filled with newly rich merchants building grand houses and commissioning portraits. The stock of the VOC became the most sought-after investment in Europe. It created the world's first stock market bubble. People mortgaged their homes to buy VOC shares. Fortunes were made overnight, but those profits were not generated by fair trade. They were generated by terror. The VOC's strategy was simple and ruthless. They would sail to the Spice Islands, the Maluku archipelago in what is now eastern Indonesia, and they would establish a monopoly by exterminating the competition. Not just the European competition, but the local populations who grew the spices. The Banda Islands were the only place on Earth where nutmeg grew naturally. The indigenous Bandanese people had been trading nutmeg with Asian and Arab merchants for centuries. They were sophisticated traders who played the Dutch, the English, and the Portuguese against each other to get the best prices. This infuriated the VOC. The VOC did not want to negotiate. They wanted total control. So in 1621, they sent a fleet under the command of Governor-General Jan Pietersoen Coen with orders to solve the Banda problem permanently. What followed was a genocide so complete that it almost erased the Bandanese from history. Coen landed on the islands with a force of over 2,000 soldiers, Japanese mercenaries, and local auxiliaries. He declared that all the nutmeg trees now belonged to the VOC. Any Bandanese caught trading with anyone else would be executed. When the local leaders resisted, Coen responded with systematic slaughter. The VOC soldiers swept through the islands village by village. They burned homes. They cut down every man, woman, and child they could find. Those who fled into the mountains were starved out. Those who surrendered were enslaved or killed. In one particularly horrific incident, 44 Bandanese leaders were brought before Coen to negotiate. He had them all beheaded in front of the remaining population. Their heads were mounted on spikes as a warning. By the time the VOC was finished, the population of the Banda Islands had been reduced from approximately 15,000 people to less than 1,000. An entire culture was wiped out. The VOC then brought in enslaved workers from Java and other islands to work the nutmeg plantations under armed guard. The Bandanese were systematically exterminated to control the global price of a spice. And it worked. With the supply of nutmeg firmly under VOC control, they could set whatever price they wanted in Europe. They made the shareholders of Amsterdam obscenely wealthy. Jan Pietersoen Coen, the architect of the genocide, was hailed as a hero. He was celebrated as a brilliant administrator who had secured Dutch commercial dominance. Today, there are statues of him in the Netherlands. There are streets named after him. He is remembered as a founding father of the Dutch Empire, not as the war criminal he was. But the Banda Islands were just the beginning. The VOC applied the same strategy across the entire Indonesian archipelago. On the island of Ambon, they forced the local population to uproot their clove trees. Only the trees that the VOC controlled were allowed to grow. VOC inspectors would sail from island to island searching for illegal clove trees. When they found them, they would burn the orchards and execute the owners. It was ecological warfare designed to create artificial scarcity. The VOC also perfected a system of forced cultivation that would become the blueprint for colonial exploitation for the next 300 years. They would arrive at a local kingdom, sign a treaty with the Sultan or Raja, and then use that treaty to demand that the local population grow cash crops for the VOC at prices the VOC set. If the locals refused, the VOC would depose the Sultan and install a puppet. If the population rebelled, the VOC would send in the soldiers. The pattern repeated across Java, Sumatra, Sulawesi, and beyond. The VOC also engaged in the slave trade on a massive scale. They captured people from across Asia and Africa and transporting them to their plantations and forts. It is estimated that the VOC enslaved over 1 million people during its 2 centuries of operation. These were not just laborers. They were soldiers, sailors, and concubines. The The VOC ran a sophisticated human trafficking operation that moved people like cargo across the Indian Ocean. By the mid-17th century, the VOC was the most powerful corporation in the world. It had over 50,000 employees. It had a private army of 10,000 soldiers. It had a fleet of over 150 merchant ships and 40 warships. It controlled a vast network of forts, factories, and trading posts stretching from the Cape of Good Hope to Japan. It generated revenues that exceeded the budgets of most European countries. At its peak, the VOC was worth approximately 78 million Dutch guilders. If you adjust for inflation and economic growth, that is equivalent to over $7.9 trillion today. That makes it the most valuable company in history, more valuable than Apple, Google, and Amazon combined. The VOC's dominance was so complete that it effectively became the government of Indonesia. The Dutch state had no presence in Asia. It was all the VOC. The VOC negotiated treaties, collected taxes, administered justice, and waged wars. It was a corporate state, a capitalist empire that answered not to voters or citizens, but to shareholders in Amsterdam. The annual reports of the VOC read like the dispatches of a conquering army. They detailed battles won, territories captured, and profits extracted. The directors of the VOC, known as the Heren XVII or the 17 Gentlemen, sat in their headquarters in Amsterdam and directed the fates of millions of people they would never meet. But the very systems that made the VOC so profitable also contained the seeds of its destruction. The first problem was corruption. The VOC operated thousands of miles away from its headquarters. Communication took months. A letter sent from Amsterdam to Batavia, the VOC's capital in Java, would take 6 months to arrive. This created opportunities for massive embezzlement. VOC officials in Asia were paid relatively low salaries, but they had access to enormous wealth. They were expected to live like princes to impress local rulers, but they could not afford it on their official pay. So they stole. The practice was so common that it had a name: private trade. VOC employees would use company ships and company resources to conduct their own private business. They would buy goods in one port and sell them in another, pocketing the profit. Technically, this was illegal. In reality, it was universal. Governors, merchants, ship captains, and warehouse managers all did it. The amounts stolen were staggering. Some estimates suggest that for every guilder the VOC officially made, its employees made 2 or 3 guilders in illegal private trade. The VOC tried to crack down. They sent inspectors. They issued regulations. They executed a few scapegoats, but the problem was structural. You could not run a global empire with 17th-century technology and expect to prevent corruption. The distance was too great. The temptation was too strong. The VOC was slowly being eaten from the inside by its own employees. The second problem was military overextension. The VOC was constantly at war. It fought the Portuguese. It fought the English. It fought local kingdoms that resisted its monopolies. It fought pirates and smugglers. Every war cost money. The VOC had to maintain forts, pay soldiers, and build warships. These costs were enormous. By the 18th century, the military expenses of the VOC were consuming more than half of its revenues. The company was spending more money on enforcing its monopoly than it was making from the monopoly itself. The VOC also faced a paradox of violence. The more brutal they were, the more resistance they provoked. The local populations hated the VOC. They resented the forced labor, the price controls, and the executions. Rebellions erupted constantly. The VOC would crush one uprising, and another would start somewhere else. It was a never-ending cycle of violence that drained resources and manpower. The VOC was stuck in the logic of empire. Once you start conquering, you cannot stop, because stopping means losing everything. But continuing means bleeding yourself dry. The third problem was competition. The VOC's monopoly was never absolute. The English East India Company was expanding aggressively in India. The French were moving into Indochina. Smugglers and private traders found ways around the VOC's controls. As the 18th century progressed, the VOC found itself competing not just with other Europeans, but with a changing global economy. New crops like coffee and sugar were becoming more profitable than spices. The demand for nutmeg and cloves was declining as European tastes changed and new sources of spices were discovered. The VOC was too rigid to adapt. It was locked into its old business model. It had invested everything in controlling specific commodities in specific places. When the world moved on, the VOC could not follow. The company that had pioneered global capitalism became a victim of creative destruction. Newer, more flexible companies could respond to changing markets. The VOC, weighed down by its bureaucracy and its empire, could not. By the 1780s, the VOC was in terminal decline. Its revenues were collapsing. Its debts were mounting. The forts in Asia were crumbling. The ships were rotting. The employees were demoralized. But the company limped on because it was too big to fail. The Dutch government could not let the VOC collapse because the entire Dutch economy was tied to it. Thousands of families in Amsterdam depended on VOC dividends. The government itself had borrowed money against future VOC profits. If the VOC went bankrupt, it would take the Netherlands with it. Then came the final blow. In 1780, the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War broke out. The English attacked Dutch shipping and seized VOC assets around the world. The VOC lost dozens of ships and several key trading posts. The war devastated what was left of the company's finances. By the 1790s, the VOC was technically insolvent. It owed more money than it could ever hope to repay. The dividends stopped. The stock price collapsed. Investors who had bought VOC shares as safe long-term investments saw their savings evaporate. In 1799, the VOC was officially dissolved. The Dutch government nationalized its assets and liabilities. The territories the VOC controlled became the Dutch East Indies, a formal colony ruled directly by the Netherlands. The company that had been worth trillions was liquidated for a fraction of its former value. The shareholders were wiped out. The employees were abandoned. The greatest corporation in history went bankrupt, leaving behind a legacy of debt and destruction. But the people who suffered most from the VOC's collapse were not the Dutch investors. They were the people of Indonesia. The VOC had spent 200 years extracting wealth and destroying local economies. When the VOC fell, it left behind a shattered society. The traditional trading networks had been dismantled. The local rulers had been turned into puppets. The populations had been reduced by war, slavery, and famine. The Spice Islands, once among the richest places on Earth, were now impoverished colonial backwaters. And the Dutch government, which took over from the VOC, only made things worse. In the 19th century, the Dutch implemented the cultivation system, which forced Javanese farmers to devote a portion of their land to cash crops for export to Europe. This system caused widespread famine and poverty. It was the VOC's forced cultivation model perfected and industrialized. The people of Indonesia would not be free from Dutch rule until 1945, after 350 years of exploitation. The legacy of the VOC is still visible today. The enormous wealth gap between Europe and Southeast Asia, the destruction of indigenous cultures, and the environmental devastation of monoculture plantations all trace back to the policies of the VOC. The company that pioneered modern capitalism also pioneered modern corporate colonialism. It proved that if you give a corporation the powers of a state, it will act like the worst kind of state, a tyranny motivated not by ideology or religion, but by pure profit. The story of the VOC also reveals the lie at the heart of the myth of free markets. The VOC was not a company that competed in a free market. It was a monopoly enforced by state violence. The shareholders of Amsterdam did not get rich through innovation and efficiency. They got rich through genocide and slavery. The Dutch Golden Age was not built on trade. It was built on theft. The elegant canal houses of Amsterdam were not paid for by clever business deals. They were paid for with the blood of the Bandanese and the sweat of enslaved Javanese. The collapse of the VOC teaches us another lesson. No matter how powerful a corporation becomes, no matter how dominant it seems, it is never invincible. The VOC seemed unstoppable in the 17th century. It controlled a monopoly on the most valuable commodities in the world. It had its own army and its own government, but it fell because it could not adapt. It fell because its costs exceeded its revenues. It fell because the violence and exploitation that built its empire eventually consumed it from within. Today, we live in a world where corporations have once again become more powerful than many governments. Tech companies control our communications. Financial firms control our money. Pharmaceutical companies control our health. These modern giants operate globally beyond the reach of any single nation's laws. They generate profits that exceed the GDP of entire countries. They lobby governments, influence elections, and shape the rules they are supposed to follow. In many ways, we are living through a new age of corporate empire. But the story of the VOC reminds us that corporate power is fragile. It is built on systems that seem stable until they are not. The VOC's shareholders believed their investment was safe. They believed the monopoly would last forever. They believed the profits would keep flowing. And then, in the span of a few decades, it all fell apart. The lesson is not that corporations will collapse. The lesson is that when they do collapse, it is the people without power who pay the price. The workers lose their jobs. The colonies lose their wealth. The investors lose their savings. But the executives, the ones who made the decisions, the ones who ordered the genocides and the forced labor, they usually walk away. Jan Pietasun Cohen died wealthy and honored. The Heeren XVII retired to their estates. The people of the Banda Islands, the people whose labor and land built the Dutch Golden Age, they got nothing. Their descendants are still poor. Their culture is gone. Their history has been erased from the textbooks sold in Amsterdam. The VOC was dissolved over 200 years ago, but its ghost still haunts the global economy. Every time a corporation privatizes profits and socializes losses, that is the VOC. Every time a company lobbies for monopoly protection while preaching free markets, that is the VOC.